Welcome to episode 5 of this collaboration between the Common Good podcast and the Liminal Space podcast. This is Tristan.
And this is Rashid. And Tristan, I've been meaning to ask, so in the pilot episode of the season, when we were sharing about stories that are grounding us at the moment, you mentioned something about us as humans having a shared consciousness. And I'm like, dude, bro, what are you talking about? Like, what on earth are you talking about? We have a shared consciousness? Like, can you please put some flesh on that and explain what you meant by that?
Okay, I mean, I do talk a lot of nonsense.
You do.
But I think this kind of makes sense. You can tell me. But over the holiday, I was reading a book by Tara Swart. The book really is about like how do you get in touch with your intuition more. It's called The Signs. And my takeout from there was that maybe our minds exist outside of our body. Okay, so that's like woo-woo and sci-fi and all of those things all at the same time. But she makes the case that people have near-death experiences. So those are people who are declared dead, medically declared dead.
Yeah.
When you interview them and you look at the research, those people experience something in that period that they declared dead. So their body has died, but somehow their mind looks down on them, or they see a light, or there's a whole bunch of different common experiences that they do, which suggests that perhaps the mind exists outside of our physical body. And she extends that a bit further to say, well, it's not that far-fetched, because actually if you think about how much of the global population believes in some sort of afterlife, then maybe it's not that far-fetched that your mind might exist outside of your physical body.
Yeah, fair.
Even if you didn't want to believe that, if we did a little mental game of suppose that were true, what becomes possible?
Yeah.
So if it were true, then it means the mind exists somewhere else. Where could that be? Well, somewhere in the cloud or something. And that might mean that there is a connection between, some kind of cosmic connection between all of us, alive and dead.
Yeah, exactly.
Which again sounds like ghost stories. So I understand that this sounds super weird.
Yeah.
But like for me, it's helpful because I think I've had experiences where you think about someone and you see them, or by supposed coincidence, there are things that make connections and you notice things when you've been thinking about them, or sometimes when you've been dreaming about them, or sometimes you think, oh, we're on the same page without having spoken. And actually in nature, we have examples where there is this kind of connection of all things. So the way trees communicate with each other, or mycelium networks and fungi being all connected, all those kinds of things. There's examples from nature that makes that not too far-fetched. Yeah. And that maybe for me, I'm curious about that because that means that we are more connected than we thought.
Exactly.
And if that's true, then I mean, what happens to me is important to you actually.
Yeah.
You know, there's a consequence.
Yeah.
And similarly, if something happens to you or things, there's a consequence on me.
Exactly.
And it's a different way of viewing our human relationships, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I don't know. Does that sound weird?
No. I think I'm with you. Yeah. It's a really cool thought. It's not really about if that's true or not. It's more just the idea of what that could open up. And I also think about, especially this idea of being connected to one another. Let's just talk as humanity for the moment, being connected with one another in ways that are like beyond just the physical that we know about. I personally have a lot of room and space for more mysterious kind of perceptions of the world or views of the world, which don't just like fall in line with like that singular, linear, rational Western perspective of the world. So yeah, that's cool. Sounds like a vibe. I mean, obviously from our context, it makes me think of Ubuntu. This fundamental idea that as humans, we created to be connected. We created to be in community, in communion with one another. So one of my favorite definitions of Ubuntu is this idea that a person is a person through other people or through other persons. So it's like the idea that my humanity, my very humanity is not complete unless I'm connected with other humans. And that's like part of the design of us as people, you know. Like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the late Archbishop, he famously described Ubuntu as meaning my humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in what is yours, which, yeah, that's also quite a cool definition. And random, but I was reading the Bible this morning, naughty.
Wow, you read the Bible?
I do sometimes. I was reading in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus speaking, and he says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." And I always know in the Bible this understanding of righteousness that usually it means something along the lines of justice, or this kind of connected justice when it relates to like humans and people. Anyway, I went on a little bit of a tangent about the Hebrew word tzedakah. It's often referred to as charity, but it's actually deeper than charity. It's connected to justice, but particularly being in right standing with one another. So it's like if I see someone who is in need or whatever, that God calls me blessed if I pursue becoming in right standing with that person, you know what I mean? In making sure that they're fine and that they're good, and yeah, that our relationship is right, not necessarily whether I know them or not, but just because we're both human, that kind of idea. So I guess it's maybe quite cool to say that, because you're talking about random mushrooms and trees and stuff, then I'm talking about Ubuntu, then I'm talking about Hebrew tzedakah, and I think that's quite cool. I think it is something that from various contexts all around the world, there's just this reality that we are connected and that we're supposed to be connected. Yeah, which is really cool.
I like that idea that we're supposed to be connected. I can't give a sermon like you just did now on the whole thing. But I think that is part of this clip from today's episode with our friend Leila, who is a really incredible human being, talking about what a communally driven world could look like or would look like.
Yeah.
She was really great in this episode.
Yeah.
I know I processed quite a lot as we were having the conversation, because Leila also speaks quite clearly and concisely in a very good way. But Leila has become a friend, and she works as a social systems researcher, a facilitator, and a designer. And her focus is on better integrating grassroots voices into systems design, advocacy, and action. And this is a clip from her episode.
Maybe in a like radical sense, I'd like to be able to see a world in which any two people could sit at a table and be able to have a conversation. And that's kind of it. It's kind of, because I think that in itself is such a good little microcosm of what we're quite incapable of doing at times. We've like built up so much capacity to others, and you don't need to belong with that person. You don't need to like them even. That's fine to have opposing beliefs, but there's like something to me in like a radical imagination that if you're just able to sit and have a conversation and recognize the humanity of the person on the other side of the table, there's some interpersonal growth and shifts in consciousness that have happened in each of those individuals to make that possible. And I wonder if from that changes our orientation towards violence in a different way. And maybe that has to scale, because it has to be then in groups. You can sit across another group, because your groupthink mind is a different thing from an individual mind and conversation. And what if you build that out and out and out? Does that look like neighbours able to have a more civil conversation if they're like a little bit upset about something, and it doesn't end up with the police being called when someone's having a noisy evening or whatever? And hopefully what that looks like more than that. And I think this is not an interpersonal thing, but if we're able to have systems that are not extractive and exploitative, I think we do end up with social dynamics and spaces where statistics of violence are less, because your survival needs are more covered. Like I think about like a world in which UBI happens, universal basic income. What does that look like? What does it look like for people to have their basic needs met? And what does that then create for what they have access to? And like, you know, we can't really take away the fact that like people have lived on land in 1,000 years ago, and if they saw someone else, they did consider them a threat, and sometimes they didn't, and they had different societies and civilizations that have gone to war or gone into negotiation and shared or not. So I'm not going to radically imagine a space in which everyone's like hunky-dory happy, because I don't think that is honest, in my opinion, about how we are, but that we maybe just have more capacity to see and experience and shake hands with someone else and then be like, well, I might not agree with you, but that doesn't mean I have to be like violent towards you or take something from you.
Yeah, it's almost like the world that we've built now doesn't have what it takes to give us that you've described, because everything has been set up so that we can live a very individual life. Like everything's been set up so we don't depend on other people, especially the wealthier you get. Actually, you just depend on yourself and your money. You don't have to go to the neighbor because you're not going to run out of stuff. And you don't need to know where your food comes from because you just go to the shop. And I mean, even like security, instead of like knowing the people around you, you'd hire, the extreme case, you have like a guard there with privacy, all that kind of stuff. And so I feel like what's happening in the world is like a return to a more communal, or at least a yearning for a more communal kind of thing. Maybe younger people are doing that more, recognizing that that's also part of being a human being, is like we do need one another. We can't be a human being by ourselves, you know.
And like you said, it is a big reason why we've also got more cults and things, which is, it's just interesting that kind of there's this move towards more communal living, but then there's also a learning that kind of needs to happen about what the kind of boundaries of that organism look like, and how insular it is, and how you create bridges from that it's more about modular communities than isolated communities, which kind of feels like, to me, maybe this has happened before, but to me that kind of seems like a really healthy focus on an evolution as a society and as humanity, that if we can learn to be in community and connected, that those walls are more open. They're maybe like picket fences rather than Johannesburg walls.
Johannesburg walls. All love to Joburg people.
Yeah, big love to Joburg people.
So Leila ends that segment with talking about Joburg walls. And if you don't know, Johannesburg is the economic capital of the country, but it's also known for having quite a high crime rate. Yeah. And very high walls as a barrier. I think in South Africa, actually, we have more private security and different security services than many other places in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
But I like Leila's framing of maybe we shouldn't aim for walls and have picket fences, as in it's just a little more open than a wall.
Yeah.
And maybe there's beyond that. Like maybe there's a beyond the gaps in the picket fence to being even something else. It's the kind of radical imagination that we're talking about. What if there is no walls? If there's no need for walls?
Yeah.
But the other idea that Leila is talking about here that I found quite interesting is something that seems quite simple but is quite radical, which is being able to sit across from anyone and have a conversation.
Yeah.
For me, the first place I went with that is sitting across from someone I absolutely disagree with and having a conversation feels like that's the most difficult thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. And especially in this world where we're so divided, and especially like politically, you either right or you left, and the other is the enemy so often, which is crazy. Yeah, we forget to see each other's humanity. It's an insane thing.
Yeah. But you also said that actually it's also even difficult to speak sometimes with people who you do agree with. There are some impediments to having a ordinary conversation with someone that maybe you don't even disagree with, but our world has been set up in a way that there might not be an opportunity to chat to someone.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes the question, like you said, it doesn't seem like a radical question, but Leila's question of could any two people, so like any two humans, sit at a table and have a conversation with one another. So I think of what are some of the impediments to that. Firstly, like geographical things.
Yeah.
You can maybe just say, okay, yeah, but we're living in Antarctica, they're living in the Arctic Circle. We're far away from each other. And yeah, fair enough, but you also have planes and stuff, so practically that could happen. But there's also like some other things on, again, like you said, how our world is set up, where we think of like visas.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like we mustn't have any nations. It's more just about the hierarchies of nation states and those barriers, social, economic things, which would all be impediments to people having a conversation.
So some questions to end the episode on, to reflect on, is maybe when was the last time you spoke to someone you disagreed with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Another question is, when was the last time you were kind to someone even though you thought they didn't deserve it?
And then maybe something very close to home. It's not just that there are people you disagree with that you don't speak to. There might be people that you do agree with. You just don't even know whether or not you do agree with them. So what if we thought about who you consider to be your neighbours? And is there a way to bridge the distance from your front door to their front door? Because sometimes you live next to someone and you don't even know anything about them really. Except that they live next door to you. And obviously we have quite a broad definition of neighbour, broader definition of neighbour, because it's not just the person immediately next to you. It could be other people in your neighbourhood, or people that you work with, or the people that you encounter at different community events and things like that as well.
Yeah, awesome. So thank you so much for being with us today. And as always, the full-length episode, which was around an hour long, is on the Liminal Space podcast. You'll find it there. Just look for Leila Kidson, and we appreciate the time with you, and we'll catch you soon.
See you soon.